All right, everybody. All right, everybody, boy. This is Anthony Brogdon, and I'm coming at you once again on Strong Inspirations with a heavy-hitting lady who I said, hey, sister, let's do it. She said, I'm ready. She told me I got to tell this story. I want y'all to hear it. I said, man, I don't know how I found it, but I did, and I'm so happy. This right here gonna blow your mind. I know you didn't know this one. I know you didn't know it. I didn't know it. I never heard of it. And I'm like, ooh, man, this is a good one here today, my friends. Let me tell you something. The train has left the station on Strong Inspirations. I got people that are coming on here telling this good history, American history, and that's what it is. They want to share it. This lady came on early. She was waiting on me. She said, man, come on. Let me get this off my chest so y'all can hear this story. Let me tell you, y'all might know I'm having my own festival. Little old me in Kansas City, Kansas, May 27th to the 29th. I can only take 1,000 of you all, though. I want 1,000 people to meet me there. I call it Freedom Quindaro. I'm jamming. It's going to be well organized, too. Y'all going to like this. You're going to like the food. You're going to like what I'm doing. You're going to like the feeling, the vibe, and understand the history of what happened in that town back in the day. I'm doing a couple of them next year. I'm going a couple places. And I'm saying to myself, well, if I'm going, because I want to go, check it out, I want to have my viewers go with me. That's what this is all about. Stay tuned. I got a Facebook page called Strong Inspirations, like that. Follow me there. I'm posting things on that page. I'm on Twitter at A Strong Dream. And I'm tweeting all the time. I'm tweeting when I got a new video. When I got an old video, I tweet it out. I'm tweeting all the time. Check me out there. There's other Facebook pages, Business in the Black Business Books, so on and so forth. Have you watched any of the videos like the guy who says his great-grandfather was in the KKK? I didn't know where he was going with that story. These people are coming over here sharing their personal stories. Did you see the video of the guy who said his great-grandfather was Josh Gibson, the baseball player? Did you watch that one? How about the one where the guy said they had his grandfather at the tree, was about to lynch him and let him go? Did you watch that one? Did you watch the one I talked to, the guy who his great-grandfather was Josiah Henson? Very famous man, in abolitionist and whatnot, and that he lives near or really in the town that's the last stop of the Underground Railroad before you go to Canada? You watch that one? There are 2, 3 others on there going of people talking about Canada. How about the one that the lady from Australia? You see that one? She said, hey, we were a black continent before they showed up, then took over. Watch that one. Hit the subscribe button on the channel. It's free. We don't ask no information. It just let me know you like me. That's all it does. And I like you already. You spending your time to watch me. I like you. So hit the subscribe button and hit the like button on this video, because I'm telling you, this lady gonna put something on your head that you did not know. And if you did know it, she's gonna tell you something in that story that you did not know. She is very proficient. She's an expert on this topic. Hit the notifications bell. When the videos come up, you get a ding, and I'm doing 4 or 5 videos a week. I'm putting up another one today. And tell somebody about Strong Inspirations. I got to tell you this story. I had a lady send me a message. She said, if you know a nice guy who knows some Strong Inspirations in my town, I'd like to meet him. I said, I don't know what to do. What town you live in, sister? Because she's good looking. what town you live in. Tell somebody, watch this, share this with your kids. Eat some popcorn while you do. Watch 2, 3 of them at a time. Watch this one on your smart TV. I tell you what else I want you to watch, and you know what I'm about to say. Watch my movie. This is how proficient I am in Black history. Business in the Black, the rise of Black business in America. 2 years of my life. I hired the crew. I wrote the script. I found the people. I found the guy that was 101 years old. He opens and closes the movie. And one of the things he said, y'all can't tell me nothing. I've been around a long time. Oh man, this is powerful. This is very powerful. Stream it on Amazon. And read my book, please. Very good book. Not just because I wrote it. I had other people tell me, but I know it is because I wrote it. I wrote it in the form like this. See, check it out. Now, don't tell nobody I told you. I'm not no big reader. I don't, them big, thick books, I be moving and stuff too fast. I get it off YouTube and I read some of them. I ain't gonna lie. I ain't gonna tell you that I don't. I'm a college graduate and everything. I wrote it for people who like me. I give you the facts straight, no chaser. I number the fact. And then if you don't believe me, I tell you where I got the fact. I give you the source. And I don't add no commentary to the fact either. I let the facts stand on their own. I got a whole chapter on all the ways slaves gained their freedom. I got a whole chapter on all the ways slaves learned how to read and write. I got chapters on how the slaves owned businesses, what the federal government did during the Reconstruction period. So it's old chapters. There's 17 chapters in this book. Get your copy. Do it today. And you can get it on Amazon or you can get it on my website. Check me out, businessintheblack.net. Go there. It's real easy. It's the first thing on the page, on the website. First thing, you order the book. Watch what this lady's about to say. Like this video. Now you hear me use that term strong a lot, right? It's my favorite word. I've been saying it a long time, and I got a license plate to say strong. Strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And as you know, since you've been watching my videos, that's the introduction for the lady on the channel today. She's a strong lady. Come on, sister, introduce your name. Let's get it on. Thank you.
Well, hello. My name is Mary Kay Ricks, and I came to this story, the story of the greatest attempted escape ever
Okay,
in America.
Since you're gonna go to the story, I gotta go. I got a sidebar for a second. I gotta talk about you for a minute.
Oh, okay.
Where you from?
I grew up outside of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And I'm a lawyer by training, but I really was in love with history, American history.
Really?
And I decided what I wanted to do, and this is back in the 80s, is to set up my own business of history walking tours in Washington, D.C.
Oh, really?
But I wanted to approach it in a different manner. I wanted to be inclusive in terms of all American history, the history of women, the history of people of color, and the fascinating history of how those intertwined in Washington, D.C. So I concentrated on certain neighborhoods in Washington, and one was the very interesting Georgetown neighborhood, which many people know from the Kennedy era. The Kennedys lived in Georgetown. It was an old tobacco port. And I'm sure everyone remembers from their American history that Washington, D.C. was taken from the states of Maryland and Virginia. And when they took that land, they took the laws with them. Now, both Maryland and Virginia were slave states.
Right.
So I wanted to talk more about this history. And then as I did my research, and I really relied on my legal training to go into documents, into wills, into court cases, and find out the depth of this history.
Okay, hold on, let me stop you there.
Yeah.
We're gonna get to it because I'm digging it. But I got a sidebar on here. There were slaves in Washington, D.C.
Yes, because There were slaves in Maryland and Virginia. And they said, when we take your land, whatever is legal in those states will be legal in the national capital of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
So in other words,
Yeah.
slavery came with the territory. That's why our capital was set up in 1800 as a slave jurisdiction. Wasn't a state, it was the nation's capital. So you had a situation where things were shifting. No, we're talking now where these rural areas are turning urban. Washington, D.C. is a brand new city. And over a very short period of time, the number of free Blacks outnumbered enslaved Blacks.
Okay.
So we had a population in the city of almost a third African American. And of that third, nearly half were free Blacks.
Okay, 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 how about that? How were they free? And how did they get there? Do you know?
Okay, many different ways. One of the most common ways is they bought their own freedom. They made a deal with their owner. I'll do your work during the day, and then I will license myself out for other jobs. Many of these enslaved people were highly skilled, master bakers, bricklayers, construction workers. Some were French pastry chefs. They worked in the hotels of Washington. And they would save their money. And eventually, many, with the agreement of the owner didn't have to do this, but there was a feeling after the American Revolution, there was a little bit more of an attitude of we should do better. And maybe slavery isn't a great thing. Unfortunately, that didn't last. You know how some movements begin and they lose steam. People felt that after the Revolutionary War. And so you had a lot of slave owners in Maryland and Virginia who put in their wills, when I die, I wish my slaves to be given their freedom. So there's another way people became free.
Okay, let me stop you there. And just give me, these questions come to mind. Okay, it's almost like I can do what I want to do. The slave owner saying that. So I can say, okay, well, I'm gonna have you because I want to. And it seems like the guy says, okay, well, if you say you're gonna have me as you want to, then I got to go along with that. But then he says, okay, well, I know I'm wrong and I don't want to have you. Why is it so easy for him to have a slave? I don't know why there's something there that says it's easy for me to make this decision that I am or I'm not, and you're going to be that person.
Well, don't forget, at the time of the American Revolution, slavery was legal everywhere in the country, in the South and in the North, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts. Slavery was legal everywhere. It was common throughout the world. Now, you didn't see a lot of slaves in Europe because many of the European countries had their slaves on the Caribbean islands. And it seemed a natural thing. It didn't start that way. Jamestown, our first settlement, 1608. There was no slavery, no system of slavery. In 1619, a ship arrived with, they think now, about 30 slaves that had been captured from a Spanish ship. It's a very complicated, convoluted maneuver. And that's when slavery began in America. And it went up into the northern states. Slaves came into New York Harbor. At the time of the Revolution, the North was willing to move away. But let's not forget, their economy was not based on slavery. They were able to go on and adjust. The numbers were not as high in the North. In the South, you had an economy that was based on it. Okay. So slavery is growing 17th century, 18th century. And now the story that we're talking about today, this great escape, took place in the 19th century.
Okay, hold on. Before we get there, how about this one? I got just a couple more. If we don't mind.
I like your questions.
Georgetown had what? The University of Georgetown had slaves.
Yes, they did. They owned slaves.
The university did.
Yes, they did.
Do they own up to that?
Yes, they do now. Only within the last 20 years have they owned up to it. In fact, Georgetown University will tell the world that they had the first Black president, a priest named Father Healy. And he was indeed Black. His mother was a slave. She lived as the wife to a wealthy white planter in the South. But Georgetown never said he was Black. People wondered if maybe he was Spanish.
So not only a darker tone to him or something like that. Or...
Very, very light-skinned.
Yeah.
They didn't know that he was an African American.
Oh, really?
Now Georgetown brags about it. So
what were their slaves doing?
Say that again?
What were Georgetown slaves doing?
Well, Georgetown slaves were owned not just by the university, but you had people all through the town who owned slaves. Now, these are urban slaves, and they're taking care of people's houses. They run hacks, what we would call cabs today. They were called hacks.
Oh, really?
Free Blacks had their own small businesses. There were free Blacks who were caterers. There were even slaves who would do catering on the side. And that the family that I focus on in my book had a lot of this kind of activity going on. So you have the other interesting thing is that there was no division between free Blacks and enslaved Blacks. People intermarried. So you could have a father who's a slave, a mother who's free. And what you have to remember that the law at this time was that any children of such a union or any union follow the status of the mother. So if the mother's free, the children are free.
Okay, let me ask you this then. If there are unions of them, the difference is one guy gets paid for what he does and the other one doesn't. Is that the difference?
That's one difference. The other difference is even more serious. The slave can be sold. A free person cannot be sold. And you had a situation bubbling up in America at this time. The international slave trade has ended. It's outlawed. The tobacco farming, where many slaves were first brought to farm, was ending in the Maryland and Virginia area. It was moving more to Kentucky and more to the western part of the country. Many of those slaves were sold south for the cotton fields. And what my research turned up, and this gets us back to this slave escape, is that when people found out, and they often found out, that there was a slave trader coming around the house talking to the owner, they knew they were in jeopardy. And that's when they thought of running. That's when they thought, I've got to get out of here. So I've been able to trace, we had 77 enslaved people on a ship leaving Washington, D.C., the US Capitol, in their escape attempt. And so many of the people for whom I've been able to find a story were escaping because they knew they were going to be sold.
Okay, let me ask you this. And okay, if I'm married and I'm enslaved and my wife is not, if I'm sold and she don't want to go with me, I'm sure.
And they don't want her. They don't want a free Black. They don't want to take someone.
Okay, but then this gets to that next question. Okay, you free, but all I got to say is I'm going to make you my slave and that's it. Why don't they just say, okay, I'm going to make you my slave?
Because there were legal protections for free people.
Oh,
and
that's the answer. That's what I'm getting at. Oh, really?
And there were white people who would claim that Black people were slaves when there was evidence that they were not. That particular slave could go to court and file what's called a petition for freedom. And I've gone through many legal cases. And it's quite extraordinary, where
Yes.
a judge would say, I believe you, you've got evidence, and you've got to have evidence that you are free, so you are hereby free. Then there are situations where there were free Blacks, and I think many people know the name of Solomon Northup, who was kidnapped from New York State and taken to the South. He was a free man, and he was held in slavery for 12 years. So you had situations where free people did not win their freedom, but you did have that legal recourse to claim your freedom.
Okay, about this, how does a person become a slave in those times? I mean, I know you, yeah, other than getting here and being born of a mother who was slave, how, I don't know if that's you follow my question.
Okay. No, it's an excellent question.
Yeah.
It's an excellent question. I think the numbers of Africans, the total number of Africans brought as slaves to the United States was 400,000. Often it was the captain of the ship who owned the slaves, brought them here and sold them.
Right.
Charleston, South Carolina was the big port at one point. Then it moved to New Orleans.
Right.
So once those slaves, so then you have natural increase of population. Children are born, next generation, and going back to the earlier point.
Right.
If you're born to a woman who is enslaved, you are a slave. So you have this natural increase in population.
Right.
So that 400,000 number by the time of the Civil War had increased to 4 million enslaved people in this country. So that's how it increased. And this is all a matter of property. It comes under property law. These human beings were property. So that's what governed. Owners had bills of sale. They would go to the county courthouse and record their ownership of someone. If you would buy a slave, you wanted it recorded to protect your property.
I got you. And they had to pay tax on it too.
Yes.
Okay, so now we're going to the story. What's the name of the story?
Well, it's often named for the ship that was brought down from Philadelphia. It was a schooner, a two-masted schooner named the Pearl. And this ship, excuse me, this ship was hired by an Underground Railroad cell in Washington, D.C., who knew they had a group of people, one family, 6 siblings.
Okay, let me stop you there. The people who hired them, are they Black or white?
Both. The Underground Railroad cell in Washington was integrated in 1848. And it's a very rare situation because Washington was unique of all slave cities. We had the US Capitol here. So that meant that there were people from all over the country, the North and the South. There were journalists here. People would come in to argue in front of the Supreme Court. Everyone would come to Washington. So you had a population, both transient and resident, who were both Black and white.
Okay.
No other Southern city had such a mix. And the Underground Railroad could not operate in those cities because if they were discovered, they could be killed. And a few were killed. They knew we can't do this.
Right.
So, but in Washington, they could. And several of the white members of the Underground Railroad came to Washington as journalists. So think of that when you're watching your journalists today on TV or reading them in the paper. This goes back to some of the people who were operatives on the Underground Railroad. They came to Washington, and how did they make contact with the Black community? Through Black churches. Black churches were enormously important in that community. If you knew your wife was about to be sold, who did you go to for advice? You went to your minister. You said, we're in trouble here. What can we do? Now, there's a good chance that in the Washington, D.C. of 1848, the minister would say, I may know someone. I might get you connected with someone. Now, oftentimes people would have to go in hiding, and they were hid in the Black community. We know that. We know the name of one couple, the Carters, who hid fugitive Blacks because you could not just run away. You didn't just look up for that North Star. That's too hard. That was a good image, but you needed organized people to help get you to cross that border, at least into the northern states and eventually into Canada for real safety. That's where you could
let me stop you right there. Now, but first of all, I know you could get to Philadelphia, right?
You could get to Philadelphia, but how? Are you going to walk from Washington, D.C.? Some did. Right. Could women and children walk to Philadelphia? It was thought no. It was thought it was far too dangerous to take children on many of these journeys. Where are you going to sleep? In a field? Are you going to be chased? Possibly.
I got you.
Yeah, usually the Underground Railroad out of Washington, D.C. took groups of 20 young men, maybe middle-aged men, hardy, people who could survive a trip like this. Did you do it in the wintertime? No, it's too hard to do it then. So sometimes you had a situation where people had to wait for months in hiding, and then a group would be put together. Now, in 1848, there was a lot of political activity about slavery. The tensions were ratcheting up. There was more talk starting about secession. And you had people thinking, maybe we need to do something dramatic. Maybe we should hire a boat. And they had done it once before. They had hired a small schooner and taken a Black family down the Potomac River, up the Chesapeake Bay, across a canal, up the Delaware Bay to Philadelphia, and they made it. In fact, they even took their furniture with them.
Okay, I like it.
Yeah, the wife said, I want my furniture, and they did it. Then they thought, okay, let's do that again, because we've got a family of 6 young people with 2 young women and their 4 brothers. We have another family of 3 generations, babes in arms, up to a grandmother, a youngish grandmother, but a grandmother nonetheless.
Sure.
It's now February, it's cold. They said, let's try and get a boat again. And they had wealthy supporters in the North, white abolitionists and some Black abolitionists. They were the money bags. So you needed all of these people. You had the Black Underground Railroad cell people. Who did they know? The ministers, the people who needed help. So you had these groups coming together. And somehow the idea grew. And I think they were in their head saying, why don't we get as many people as we can? They ended up with 77 people signed up to go on this ship, which I think is just mind-boggling.
Okay, let me stop you there. How do you think they found all those people? Did they like a secret code to start talking to the people that were enslaved in that nearby neighborhood and said, hey, there's something going down that you can get your freedom?
Yes, to a certain extent. They didn't need secret codes. They could just talk to each other at their churches, in their homes. They had to be very careful. They had to reach out to people they thought they could trust.
I got you.
You know, there are turncoats in every element of human society.
Yeah. That's what happened to that guy in South Carolina, Vesey.
Oh, sure.
That's right, happened. He had a big escape thing he was doing, and somebody turned on him. They know who turned on him.
Unfortunately, it's thought this happened in this case. That there was a Black man in the community, a free Black man, who turned on them for money. We're not absolutely sure of it, But we have the accounts from the descendants of people who were on that ship in 1848. That story was not only passed down orally, one of the descendants in 1930 wrote a book about it. And that was one of the main sources for my information.
Oh.
So again, the churches, absolutely central to this. People who knew their families were going to be sold would make their way to the ministers. They would also seek out the one or two white congressmen who were sympathetic to them. And those congressmen would say, ah, I know someone you can talk to. And they might send them to the white organizer of the Underground Railroad, but they all had to work together. So they hired a boat. They found a captain. He's the same man who did the first trip when the woman took her furniture. And he wanted to make a living at this. Was he an abolitionist? Probably not at that time. He wanted to earn money to do this.
So here's some passengers.
He would be paid.
Yeah, right.
Money would come from the north.
Right.
And he would be able to finance this trip.
Right.
So it's quite a picture when you think about it. On April 15th, they're told you have to be at the ship before 10 o'clock. The ship is going to be leaving at 10. And 10 o'clock was the curfew for all Black people. Blacks in Washington, D.C. had to be off the streets at 10 p.m. So you go quietly through the streets in small groups. They do not go in large groups because they'd be stopped.
Okay,
So
hold on, let me
would.
stop you there. And I think you're going to, you watch this question. These enslaved Blacks did have some freedom to walk around themselves. They just had to go home.
By 10 o'clock, yes. They could go to visit each other. You see, what's interesting about this is we're talking about urban slavery. We're not on a plantation out in Maryland, Virginia, or Mississippi.
Right.
You know, we're in the city. And you can't tell by looking at someone whether they're free or enslaved.
Got you.
Now, white authority figures and even just prominent white people could challenge a Black person and say, show me your free papers. They were required to prove that they were free. The assumption was, the legal assumption was, if you're Black, you're a slave. So if you're free, the burden is on you to show proof. So quietly, in groups maybe of 2, 3, no more than 4, they made their way from Georgetown, from other parts of Washington, D.C., right near the White House. Dolly Madison, famous First Lady, married to James Madison, one of her slaves escaped. She knew she was going to be sold. The slave trader had come to talk to this woman who was revered in America, Dolly Madison. And these people made their way to the ship and they boarded. They got ready to take off.
Okay, stop you right there. How about this one? Where was the ship docked? Is that a point now that you know where it is? And is there a marker there or anything like that? There
is a marker in the general 7th Street Wharf area, which was the main, was kind of 7th Street. It went right down past the Smithsonian, which was just being built. They had just started building the Smithsonian, but they had to take the ship. It had come in from Philadelphia with a load of wood, which it sold. But when it was time to load up the fugitives, they moved to a secluded wharf down an area called Buzzard's Point.
Okay.
Because they couldn't have anyone see.
Right.
The fugitives coming. They had to come. And the organizers, the people in the community who worked with the Underground Railroad, I'm assuming all African-American. White people didn't go out there and help show the fugitives where the ship was.
I got you.
This was done from within the community.
I got you.
So they get them on the ship. They load them down into the hold. They've got food there. They're ready to go. Totally dependent on their sails, and the wind dies. The wind dies and they go nowhere. and they drift out into the Potomac River, and they have to put their anchor down to stop from being pulled back into the city. They spend the night on the ship. The next morning, thank God, the wind picks up.
Okay.
They make it about 100 miles down the Potomac River, right to where the river flows into the Chesapeake Bay. And a huge storm comes. They can't turn up into the Chesapeake. They have to wait out the storm. Meanwhile, back in Washington, it's Sunday morning. The white people go to church and they go, you know, my slave's missing. Other white people are going, my slave's missing. And they're all comparing notes. And they realize that there's a grand theft at hand. That's what they called it. Our property has been stolen. They form a posse. The posse jumps into a steamboat. So they don't have to rely on the wind. They have steam power. And they take off down the river. It's probably 2 or 3 in the morning. It's still dark. They don't see anything. And just as they're getting ready to turn and go back to Washington, assuming that the Pearl with the fugitives had gone up the river, they see it. They see it, they board it, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And the fugitives are captured.
Mm.
They're towed back to Washington, D.C. And the story just goes on from there. Yes, the escape failed. It almost succeeded. Not only did it almost succeed, it captured the attention of the whole country. And yet we don't know the story today. It only was just put into the DC textbook, history textbook, at the same time I was doing my research. I wasn't involved in it, but wonderful historians had just put it into the textbook.
Okay.
There were trials in Washington, D.C. The ship captain, and he had hired another captain with his ship. They are on trial. What happens to the fugitives? Well, the slave owners know these slaves have run once. They might run again. We've got them back because they had been put in jail. They were marched through the streets of Washington with crowds lining the street, including Blacks watching this. Even relatives of some of the fugitives were watching them and taken to jail. And the slave traders come because the owners want to sell. And all but a handful were sold to slave traders. One came down from Baltimore, a man named Hope Slatter. What a name for a slave trader, Hope. Alexandria, Virginia, just across the river. Washington, D.C., known for its slave traders. And the slaves were taken by the traders and gradually moved down to either Richmond, Virginia, which was a clearinghouse for selling slaves, other points along the Mississippi River, other towns and cities, and finally you got to the central slave trading hub, New Orleans. And I profile one family, the Edmondson family.
Okay.
And they ended up in New Orleans. And the 2 girls were 13 and 15 years old. They were attractive young women. They were talented young women. This family was known as the best servants to be had in Washington, D.C. They were hired out. The people who owned them lived out in Maryland, but they were hired in Washington because that's where you would make money. And people in the North, working with the girls' father, who was free, their mother was a slave, that's why they were enslaved. The father owned a 40-acre farm.
Whoa.
First, he bought 20 acres, I believe, in 1835, and he bought 20 more in 1842. And just to give you an idea of how valuable slaves were, and a lot of people don't think of this, if he sold his farm at the going rate of what agricultural land was worth then, he might have only bought 1 daughter 40 acres of farmland, and he would not have been able to buy more than one of his children. So he had 4 sons and 2 girls, but they were most concerned about the daughters because they were often used for sexual purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah, attractive young women.
Yeah.
Yep. So frantically, people were raising money in the North. And a famous preacher, Henry Ward Beecher. Actually, he wasn't famous then. He became famous
no, I
later.
recognize the name. Yeah.
Yeah, people know the Beechers. And his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah, okay. I knew this. Yeah.
Brother and sister worked hard to raise money in the white and Black churches in New York City. And the girls were in New Orleans when yellow fever broke out. Now, yellow fever killed people. Some years it would be really bad, other years it wouldn't. The slave owner who had bought them, his name was Joseph Bruin, brought them back up to Alexandria, Virginia, because he didn't want his property to die. And that gave them a chance. They weren't lost. You know, when you end up in New Orleans and you're sold to a plantation in Mississippi, in Louisiana, you sometimes can't even find people.
Sure.
And that happened to one of their brothers. One of their brothers was not found until he turned up in a census report. So the girls were in Alexandria, Virginia. People were raising money in New York City. And by God, they did it. They were able to redeem, and that was the phrase they would use. They redeemed them from slavery. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe got involved and financed their studies first in New York at a college where kind of like we would call a community college,
Sure.
where they could learn to read and write.
Sure.
And then she sponsored them at Oberlin College in Ohio, at a preparatory school there.
Sure.
So, you know, what a journey. What a journey this family had. Some of the other slaves were not so lucky. But we know one man who wasn't sold south. His owner came and took him back to Georgetown. He was a wealthy man. He had been either a congressman or a senator, I don't remember. He ended up freeing him on his death, and he died a year or so later. And this enslaved man's name was Alfred Pope. He became a builder. He owned land in Georgetown. He helped, he was very involved in the Black church there. So you had all these different people. Some they couldn't help. The young woman who was owned by Dolly Madison, former First Lady, her freedom was purchased out of a Baltimore slave pen. We don't know what happened to her after that, but we know she was freed. So the thing about this story is that no, it didn't end well for all of them, only a very small number.
Yeah.
But it brought more attention to Americans of what was going on. And for this to happen in Washington, D.C., it was an embarrassment to the country.
Okay. What now? Let me ask you, why did they call it the Pearl Incident? Did you say that? Why?
Yes, because that was the name of the schooner.
That was the name of the schooner.
That was the name of the boat.
What was the punishment for the captains and the that were on the boat?
Oh, right. They were charged with slave stealing and aiding the slaves' attempt to flee.
Right.
And their attorney made a very good argument. How do you steal someone who's already stolen themselves?
Oh, okay.
The fugitives had made the choice to get on that ship, and they won that argument. So they were convicted of aiding a slave escape, and it wasn't as serious. They were fined so much money, they couldn't leave jail. They were stuck in jail for 4.5 years until finally they received a presidential pardon.
Oh, really?
Yes, they did. So they ended up, I think, broken men. I think 4.5 years in a penitentiary, in a jail. I'm not sure if it was a penitentiary. I think it was more of the jail.
Yeah.
You know, you end up in a place like that, you often come out with tuberculosis. You come out ill, you come out broken.
Wow. Wow. So if it wasn't for that bad weather, all things considered, we could think they would have made it.
Yes. Yes.
When that other ship came upon them, they just saw, because I would imagine there were a bunch of ships in the water at that time. Why did they think that was the ship or whatever?
Well, in April, it's not prime shipping season. There were a few other boats that had passed them. As the Pearl was going down the river, a few boats came up the river. And in fact, one of them later told them in Washington, there's a suspicious schooner heading south. But there weren't that many ships.
Okay.
They knew what they were looking for. They knew it was a schooner. They had been told that this schooner had left the main part of the harbor and had gone to another part. So they knew.
Okay.
And they had guns. This was a posse.
Well, and they might have known, as from what you had alluded, that one guy, he might have told them.
Yes, his name was Judson Diggs. And the descendant of the family, the Edmondsons, who I really write a lot about. And I wrote a book about the incident. So I do have a book. I can show it to you in a minute. But yeah, they said he went and told the posse. The posse had gone out to the roads looking for the fugitives. They weren't thinking they had gone by water.
Yeah.
And so they bumped into this Judson Diggs, and he said he might have some information. This is what is alleged. And they paid him. And he said, look to the river. Look to the river. Yep.
I wonder who busted him that he might have been the snitch.
John Painter, who was of the family who were trying to escape, said that he was hated in the Black community, that he was thrown in the river himself, didn't kill him, but he was just held out in ignominy.
Yeah, so maybe he really didn't do it, but they knew that he could be the type that would have done it.
Possibly.
Yeah, I got you.
Possibly.
I got you.
He knew the family. We know that, but from records that I found.
Yeah.
But this is a story that opens up so much of American history, so much about the African-American community in the 19th century in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I love
and it's
it.
you just trace this and you keep getting more and more information.
Yeah.
The two young women who were freed by the Beechers, they went on to become very close with Frederick Douglass.
Okay.
They went on a circuit in the North to raise money for the Underground Railroad and for their own family members. They were raising money to try and free their brothers.
Yeah.
Remember, they had 4 brothers. One of the brothers was the butler of a very prominent lawyer in Washington. He was the city attorney for the city of Washington. And he escaped from New Orleans. He ended up on a ship leaving New Orleans and went to both Liverpool and Australia.
Wow.
Now, that was in the book written by his descendant. And some people said, that can't be true. And the man who wrote the book called it a novel. And there were things, he didn't quite know how it was organized. And he tried to, you think of how do you think they did it? And he was right in some ways and not in others, because we were able to get more information. But it's just, a fabulous trove of detail on the lengths that people would go to try and save their families, to try and avoid being sent to a plantation, because you're used to living in a city.
Yeah, I got you.
There are, different grades of slavery. Some of the plantations were just so cruel.
Yes.
So cruel. So, there's just so much. Anyway, on this story, we didn't know if it was true.
Yeah.
Until I went through the census records. And this was Brother Samuel Edmondson. And I found the census of 1870. And he had come back to Washington with his wife and 2 children. Now, when you look at these census, the first thing they ask, one of the first things about the children is where were they born? One child was born in Liverpool, England, and one child was born in Australia. It was a true story.
Oh my God.
People, there was no reason to make that up.
Yeah, sure.
You're just report, the census taker comes to your house. You don't say, well, oh, I think I'll make something up.
Yeah, sure.
There's no gain in that. So
sure. Let me ask you this question as we kind of come to a close. How long did it take you to do the research, maybe, to just get to what happened when they captured the ship?
well, I did research for a number of different purposes. One was for my tours. I'm doing history walking tours, and I want to tell the story because no one seems to be telling it in depth in Washington at that time. So I do my research for that. Then I decided this story is so important, it needs to be written up in the Washington Post. So I did more research, and the Post said, yes, we want to publish it. So I published that. But I couldn't leave the story alone. I wanted to do more on the two girls, the sisters. So I did another article for the Washington Post magazine.
I got you.
And then that became the basis of a book proposal. I'll just hold up my book.
Yeah, pull up the book, yeah.
Can you see it?
Escape on the Pearl.
And this has everything I researched over maybe 6 years.
Okay.
And in the back, there's a list with the name of every fugitive who was on the Pearl.
Oh, really?
Yes, because their names were offered in trial. And the names of their owners.
I love it. I love it. Let me ask you this. One more question. So there ain't gonna be no one more. In your tours, do you walk people to where the ship left?
No, because that was a little too widespread. They'd be walking, for 10 hours if I tried to do that. But I did several bus trips, and I did a couple of trips for the Smithsonian. I worked very closely with the oldest Black church in the District of Columbia called Mount Zion. And several members of their congregation were on the ship. And it's one of the few African-American churches of that time period that still had records. Their records were intact. So I could look up, it took me a while to gain people's trust. I couldn't just walk in there and say, show me your records. It took some time. And then I was able to see that members of the family I was profiling and people who were listed in the court records were members of the church. So all of that information was pulled together.
Oh, I got you. As we come to close, is there a question in this regard that I have not asked you?
No, I think you've been very
okay.
thorough. Here's one. I do have one.
Yeah.
This goes right back full circle to how you opened. You said, I didn't know this story. And I think the question here is why? Why didn't you know the story? Why didn't I know the story?
Yeah.
It's because Washington, D.C., after the end of the Civil War, and some years of relative freedom in terms of politics, African Americans were even allowed to vote for a short period.
Sure.
It then fell into Jim Crow law. So we had segregated schools in Washington. We had Jim Crow in charge, and people didn't want students studying about this in either Black schools, and there were some very good Black schools at the time, and they didn't want it brought up in white schools. So when you take an incident like this of history and you take it out of the school books or never put it in the school books, it gets lost.
I got you.
And it took academics to wrench this history back into the school books. And now there are organizations in Washington celebrating the Pearl. It's honored on April 15th every year, the anniversary of the date when it left. And I think it's being looked at more and more as really an example of where this country has come from.
Yes, I love it. Okay. Everybody, this is what I do is strong. I'm sitting here with my mouth open. Everybody, I'm saying, whoa, my golly. I don't
It's
know
a
how I
story.
found her. I don't know how I found the story or whatever, but I mean, I'm getting pretty good at, looking around here. And
I'm glad you found it.
yeah, I'm so glad you agreed to come on the channel. My God, you knocked it out the park, the box.
Oh, thank you.
Oh my God, thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
Everybody, come on now. If that don't make you subscribe, I don't know what do. If you don't like this video, I don't know what video you will like, but I'm gonna keep coming at you. Hit the notification bell when the videos come up. You know that there's a new video and you want to watch it because it's gonna make your mouth open and drop because of these conscious people willing to spend a lot of their time to share this with you.
And thank you for
with
the
us.
work you do.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so very much. Strong inspirations. Watch my movie, read my book for sure. Read her book. Where's your book available? It's on Amazon and
Sure, and it's in both paperback and hardback.
Okay, we're gonna put all that description. Do you have a website yourself?
I do not. No, I stopped my tours and I'm actually working on another book set in that same time period.
Oh, really?
So,
okay.
yeah, it
Well,
keeps me busy.
Follow you still nonetheless and stay
Good.
in contact.
Please do.
Everybody, thank you so very much for coming on the channel. And I want to say this with all sincerity, that I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. I love what you're doing, that you have taken time to find your new calling and use those skills as in the legal world to come up with some documents that help you define the story very succinctly as you have.
It's a story
It's
of
a
America.
beautiful thing that you let us know what happened and how people came together to help them escape and almost succeeded. And still we rise, as they say. Thank you again for coming on the show. And I'll say bye-bye, we out. Peace.
Thank you.